This is a set of cast aluminum wheels from a 1990s Mercury Grand Marquis.
1.9% financing or $12.50 cash back.
You might not think of a boat like a Grand Marquis as a sporty car, but these wheels are actually pretty popular for certain 80s sports cars, since they're 5x114, somewhat dishy, and inexpensive. I picked up these wheels for almost no money with the intention of using them on my S13. But as you can see, these ones are in pretty appalling condition, and frankly, they should be buried below the junkyard. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I completely restored these wheels, turning them from this into this. Since this is an all-aluminum wheel, I decided I was going to paint the faces, but leave the lips as bare polished aluminum. The wheels came from the factory with a painted finish, which means I had to strip the entire lip back to bare metal. Initially, I tried to do this with my sandblaster, and while this worked pretty well on the flaky, corroded areas, it became clear pretty quickly that my hobbyist sandblaster setup wasn't going to cut it on this hard wheel paint. I then went for a more chemical approach and tried using paint stripper. This proved to be even less effective than the sandblaster, and did absolutely nothing. I don't know what they've done to paint stripper these days, but I tried 3 separate products with 0 success. So having exhausted my other options, I went nuclear and started attacking the wheels with a wire brush. Now, this may have been a mistake. The wire brush was effective, but it added a ton more labor onto the job. If you're trying this yourself, I'd really recommend you hunt down a paint stripper that actually works. Go ask your dad if he's got something hardcore from the 80s lying around. But hindsight is 20/20. At the time, I just pressed on with the wire wheel. I used a combination of steel wire wheels for both a drill and an angle grinder, depending on what part of the wheel I was stripping. Typically you shouldn't use a steel brush on aluminum, since it will both scratch up the surface and leave small steel particles in the aluminum that can create rust spots. Since this is a cast aluminum wheel, I knew I was going to have to do a lot of finish sanding anyways, so I wasn't worried about either of these. What was important was that the paint was finally coming off. Once I'd finally gotten all the paint stripped off the lips, this is what I was left with. As expected, the wire brush left the metal quite rough, and these are still going to need a lot of work to get that to a mirror shine. But for the time being, I was incredibly tired of working on the lips, and I figured I'd pay some attention to the faces. The centers of the wheel were in really rough shape, with quite a bit of bubbling and flaking paint. These didn't need to be brought back to bare metal, so I was able to clean them up with a sandblaster. Okay, break time's over. Back to the lips. At this point, the task at hand was to take this rough finish and sand it until it was mirror smooth. Easy, right? No, actually. Pretty stupid question. This sucked. For everybody's sake, I'm going to condense like 4 hours of tedious shit work into like 30 seconds. I started out with 220 grit, which is coarse enough to really take off material, and it made pretty light work of the scratches I created with the wire wheel. This is an unsanded wheel, and this is one that was sanded at 220. I then upped the grit count to 400 and sanded everything again. This is that same unsanded wheel next to a 400 grit wheel. At this point, the surface had a nice, smooth, brushed finish, and it was time to work on making it shiny. I wet sanded with 1000 grit, then did the same with 2000 grit. I'm dead inside. The last step was polishing them with some metal polish. I used a drill-mounted polishing wheel, which worked good, but this probably would have been easier with one of those big polishing wheels that mounts to a bench grinder. And with that, the lips were finally done. It's not quite a mirror finish, but I'm happy with it. Even with the gross, untouched faces, these wheels are starting to look presentable. I then immediately covered the fruits of my labor in masking tape to protect them from getting scratched up while I worked on other areas of the wheels. I shifted my attention to the insides of the wheels, which were caked in an ungodly amount of brake dust. Whoever was using these wheels last was definitely running brake pads from AliExpress. I started stripping them with some triple-aught steel wool until I realized that I'm not a goddamn caveman and threw the wheels back in the sandblasting cabinet. The sandblaster made short work of the brake dust, not that you'd ever know it from this horrible footage, and in no time the backs of the wheels were metal colored again. Hey, remember sanding? I do. I spent 1,000 years doing it one weekend. It was now time to prep the faces for paint. Even I'm not stupid enough to think paint was going to stick to this clear coat, so I had to go through and rough up every face on each wheel. This wouldn't be a big job on a nice set of 5-spoke wheels, but this is where my love of mesh really screwed me over. Each of these wheels has 75 little holes between the spokes, all of which need to be sanded inside of, plus the fronts of the spokes, and also the centers. Luckily I only had to do each wheel once with 220 grit, but even this took nearly as long as the lips did. Again, I'm just going to cut down hours of work to a length that won't make us all want to jump in a river. See, that wasn't so bad. Once I was done prepping the faces, I removed the old masking tape and reapplied. The old layer had been scuffed up since application, and I wanted a really crisp tape line around that edge of the face. Finally, it was time to spray. I started with a couple coats of primer. This is Rust-Oleum Painter's Touch, out of a can obviously. I'm still a hack after all. The primer got good coverage, so I only needed about 2 coats. To get all the nooks and crannies on these mesh wheels, you end up going over certain spots multiple times, so it's important to spray very light to avoid runs. For the paint, I went with this nice Rust-Oleum Gold Rush. I really wanted to go gold on these wheels because gold mesh on a red car looks amazing, but I didn't want anything over the top metallic or sparkly. This paint ended up being exactly what I was looking for. This didn't have quite the coverage that the primer had, so I ended up doing closer to 5 coats. Typically when I paint wheels, I also throw on a heavy clear coat, but I opted not to for these wheels, since the mesh puts them in higher risk of needing touch-ups, and touch-ups are harder to do if you have to deal with clear coat. With the tape peeled, this is what we ended up with. Overall, I'm very happy with the result. When I decided to refinish these wheels, this is exactly what I was picturing in my head. Just as a reminder, this is what we started with, and this is what we have now. The car doesn't have the right bolt pattern yet, so I can't really show you what they'll look like mounted up, but here's an approximation. If you're having trouble imagining, just subscribe and you can see what they'll look like when I finally mount them on the car. If you're watching this because you have your own set of aluminum wheels you want to fix up, just go for it. I made it look a bit harder than it actually is. I made a lot of work for myself based on the approaches I chose, but in my opinion, the best way to get a nice set of wheels for your car is to make your own. Don't let TikTok clout chasers convince you that you need to spend $4,000 on a set of who gives a shits for your car to be cool. Just buy something you like, make them nice, put them on the car, and you're good. Anyways, that's all for this video. If you made it this far, congratulations on having good taste, and I'll see you in the next one.